Hello everyone, welcome to session 5 of LTEC 623. This week I want to begin by reviewing some of the terminology we learned about last week related to digital audio. Of course, we learned about frequency and amplitude, and we understand that the frequency of a sound wave changes its tone. Wide or long wavelengths produce lower tones, and more frequent or shorter wavelengths produce higher tones. In contrast, amplitude, or the height of a sound wave, changes its volume. We also learned about some of the details of recording digital audio. For example, we read about sampling, or the process of turning analog audio waves or sound waves into digital audio data. We learned that a single slice of a sampled sound wave is called a sample, and that happens at a specific point in time. And we also learned about sample resolution, or bit depth, or in Audacity settings, sample format. And that defines how many bits of data are used to define a single sample. And the higher that bit depth is, the more information is being stored related to a single sample. Finally, we learned about sampling frequency, which defines the number of samples taken per second. And that's typically measured in kilohertz. And so for vocal recordings, we typically want something around 44 kilohertz or 48 kilohertz. For reference, CD quality, which is a little bit old at this point, is defined as using a 16-bit sample resolution and a 44 kilohertz sampling rate. Now, one of the most important things I want you to take away from last week's lesson on digital audio is the importance of monitoring your recording levels. When recording your voice, try to record between 12 and 6 decibels. Remember that the scale is negative, so that's negative 12 to negative 6. So what does this mean? This means that your peak value is no higher than negative 6 decibels. Now, in a more unpredictable environment like a park or on a sidewalk, you should use lower levels. So something between, say, negative 24 and negative 12. And this gives you more quote-unquote headroom in case something loud happens. You can capture that without the recording actually clipping. Now, why do we care about any of this? Well, because we learned last week that empirically we know audio quality matters when it comes to video. As we talked about, audio quality impacts people's perceptions of how good a talk is, whether the speaker is smart, whether the speaker is likable, and whether or not the research being presented about is important. So audio quality matters. And with that, I want to continue working our way around this Venn diagram. We've talked about production style and production value. And today I want to talk about visual aesthetics, which refers to the beauty or pleasing appearance of video. And traditionally or philosophically, aesthetics has to do with aspects of balance and color, proportion, and novelty. And today we're going to talk about the aesthetics-related features that distinguish high-quality professional videos from low-quality amateur ones. And in order to do that, we'll take a look at some related areas of study, such as visual design, photography, and videography. So let's get started. First, I want to talk about some of the features of high-quality visual design. And those of you who have taken visual design with me, which is another course, you know that good design involves 3 steps. Learning the principles of good design, recognizing when those principles are not being used, and in turn, applying those principles of good design. So what are those principles? Well, you can see some of them here. Layout, alignment, hierarchy, proximity, color, contrast, so on and so forth. So let's think a little bit about applying these principles to the jigsaw method video we watched a couple weeks ago. So here's a screen capture of one point in time of that particular video. And so the question is, do we see alignment? And I would argue, yes. The visual design property of alignment is applied to this particular Chalk and Talk video. And as you can see here with these pink lines, there are clear rows and columns to the way that this is laid out. Do we also see hierarchy? I would say yes. There is a heading, forms of government, which indicates what all of the items below it are related to. That's an example of visual hierarchy. Do we also see proximity? Well, yes, of course. It's so obvious we don't even really think about it, but each note card is close to its label. And that closeness or that proximity helps the viewer understand that in this case, that the red card signifies democracy. So that word and that graphic are close together, and that proximity helps us understand that they're related. Now, another important technique in visual design is to divide up a composition into thirds, both vertically and horizontally. And this is known as the rule of thirds. And the idea behind the rule of thirds is that you want the most important aspects of a design to be placed at the intersections of the grid. So let's see if the rule of thirds applies to the jigsaw method. Here we can see that there is some sort of logical layout. And even though there's not important information right at those intersections, we still get a sense that the columns and the rows of the rule of thirds are being used in this particular layout. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about features of high quality photos. What can we learn from photography that might help us think about what makes professional videos? Well, some researchers have looked into this, and one of the things that they found is that most professional photos actually have an element of simplicity to them. In other words, professional photos are simple. And they're simple because it's obvious what to look at. And it's easy to separate the subject from the background. Now let's take a look at some examples. So how do we separate the subject of a photo from its background? Well, one way to do that is to change the focus. So you can see here with this picture of the praying mantis, the photographer has changed the lens aperture so that the background is blurred out, but the subject, the praying mantis, is actually very much in focus. So that's one way to bring about simplicity and to tell the viewer what's important to see. Another example is color contrast. And in this example, the photographer has captured this flower in a way that the yellow flower really complements that blue sky in background. And so that contrast in color really makes the flower itself pop out. So color contrast is another example of how to separate the subject from the background. Or another technique is using lighting contrast. So we can see here with this particular flower, some of the picture is very, very dark and black, but the center there, the main part of the flower is actually almost glowing in how white it is. So again, another example of a technique used to separate the subject from the background, which is important in making it obvious what the viewer should be looking at. Now, another feature of high-quality photos is realism. Now, if we think about snapshots that we take just on our phone or off the cuff look real, whereas professional photos tend to look more surreal. And the reason for that is snapshots tend to depict everyday objects in everyday settings. In other words, exactly what the eye sees in everyday life. But in contrast, professional photos use certain techniques to make their photos atypical or make certain things stand out. So let's take a look at some examples. One of the ways that professional photographers make their photos stand out is by changing the color palette. They will wait till certain times of the day to get just the right lighting. Another example is that professional photographers are able to manipulate their camera settings, adjusting the focal length, the aperture, and the shutter speeds to show different perspectives and create different moods. For example, as shown here with this river, this photographer used a longer shutter speed in order to capture the waterfall over time to give it this misty and calm feeling. That's an example of an atypical photo. And here's another way is the subject matter might be everyday, such as a car on a road. However, professional photographers take pictures of ordinary objects, but they compose the photograph using unusual poses or unusual settings. Okay, so far we've talked about features of high quality visual design and features of high quality photography, but what about features of high quality video? Well, for that, we're going to turn to Herbert Zettel's book, Sight, Sound, Motion, Applied Media Aesthetics. And Zettel argues that applied media aesthetics is actually a process. And it's a process in which we examine a number of media elements, such as lighting and sound, and how they interact, and how those elements affect our perceptions and reactions to a given media experience. And in his book, he argues that there are 4 fundamental elements. There's light and color, there's space, which involves 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. There's also time and motion, and finally there is sound. So let's do a little bit of digging into each of these fundamental elements. So light and color. We all know that light is a form of energy, but in high quality video, we really focus on the importance of lighting. And lighting is the deliberate manipulation of light and shadows for communication purposes. Now, related to lighting is color. And we know that color is a property of light. And we see color when our eyes receive light of certain wavelengths reflected off of objects. And of course, color is very important because it can tell us more about a scene. We simply get more information from a color picture than we do from a black and white one. And of course, there are also feelings and moods associated with different colors. Now, a second element is space, and I'm just going to talk about 2-dimensional space here in relation to video. We know that screens are 2-dimensional spaces with a height and a width, and that they can differ in size and in their aspect ratio. And aspect ratio is simply the relationship of width to height. Most of the time, the screens that we designed for have a horizontal orientation. And the reason for this is that our human peripheral vision is greater horizontally than it is vertically. So we're trying to mirror that perceptual reality that we have as humans. Now, importantly, in 2D space, there's this idea of the aesthetics of size. And this has to do with our perception of how big objects are when they're shown on screen. And the way we determine whether or not something is big or small on screen is whether or not we have knowledge of the object. Oh, do we recognize that's a quarter or that's a baseball bat? Or we might get information about the size in relation to the screen area. Something's going to look bigger if it's taking up more of the screen. And then there's also this idea of contextual scale. If you put a quarter next to a baseball, we get some context to understand how big the coin is relative to the ball. That's an example of contextual scale. We also know that high quality video is not just focused on the 2 dimensions of space, but a 3rd dimension, also known as the z-axis. And the z-axis tells us how far objects seem to be from the camera. And of course, we can think about our high school art classes where we learned about perspective and the horizon line and vanishing points. But importantly, some things that we don't even think about when we're watching videos is how far away those objects are. And there are a number of different factors that help us determine the depth or the distance away from us on the z-axis. So one of the factors is overlapping planes. In other words, if 2 objects overlap each other, we'll be able to determine which one is in front of the other. Another example is relative size. Something closer to the camera is going to appear larger. Height and plane, that has to do with objects that are higher on the screen feel or are perceived as being further away. And finally, another factor has to do with linear perspective. This idea that equally spaced objects appear closer together the farther away they are from the camera. And of course, we can also play around with the depth or that 3rd dimension of video by using different lenses. So we can manipulate the relative size and perspective of our objects on the video screen. And so wide angles kind of exaggerate the size and the distance between objects, whereas a narrow angle lens de-emphasizes this. So another feature of high quality video is time and motion. And time classically is considered the 4th dimension and helps us establish spatial and temporal order. And importantly, when thinking about time in relation to video, we need to keep track of objective time versus subjective time. Objective time has to do with what the clock says. This movie is 1 hour and 20 minutes. It can be measured quantitatively. However, subjective time has to do with how we feel, our perception of how long the movie was. And it's really processed more qualitatively than quantitatively. As people working with video, it's important that we recognize that subjective time can be manipulated. And as people working in video, we can manipulate subjective time through the number of events we display or the intensity of those events. I'm sure you've all seen a movie that was particularly intense and emotional. And so that the subjective time of that particular movie was probably longer than its objective time. Another important feature of high quality video, of course, is motion. And motion is perceived when something changes position relative to a more stable environment. And we perceive motion automatically, and we do that by establishing a frame of reference. And of course, one of the things we have to determine as viewers, and we do this almost automatically, is, well, how fast is something going that's moving on the screen? Now, the last feature of high quality video is sound. And we've already talked quite a bit about sound, but sound is used for communication purposes. And we'll contrast that to noise, which is just random and unwanted sound waves. In video, sound can be source connected. In other words, we see what's making the sound, perhaps this gentleman playing the violin, or sound can be source disconnected, which means we hear a sound, but we can't see what's actually producing the sound. Some other important dimensions of sound is sound perspective, which refers to where a sound is perceived to be coming from. Is it coming from behind us, in front of us, to the left of us? And also we have sound continuity, this idea that a person's voice, for example, we expect it to maintain a certain volume and quality from scene to scene in a video. It shouldn't change unless the character's situation changes in the video. Sound is used in video for different reasons. So one of the main reasons, of course, or functions of sound is to be informational. And that really has to do with all forms of speech, such as my voice right now. The intention of including this sound in this video is to provide information to the viewer. And so by forms of speech, we mean dialogue, direct address, or narration. Another function is outer orientation. And these types of sounds try to orient the viewer to a particular space or time or situation. So is the events in the video, are they happening downtown in a noisy city? Or are they happening in the countryside? Sounds with outer orientation would help us figure out the setting in which the video is taking place. Now let's contrast that to inner orientation. This idea that sound can be used to establish a mood or some sort of internal condition or energy. And that's often done through music, which helps prompt the viewer to feel a certain way. And then finally, sound can also form a structural function to help supplement the rhythm of the visuals. So you may be wondering, why are we talking about visual design, photography, and the 4 elements of media? And really wondering, why are we talking about applied media aesthetics? Well, we're talking about this because we want to develop the knowledge and skill so that we're able to select aesthetic elements that are going to result in optimally effective communication and allow us to reflect our artistic sensitivities. Okay, everyone, we're out of time for this week. Have a great week, and I'll see you in Canvas.